Hello, welcome back. It's good to see you again. This week, we want to share our preparation for our planned visit to Fontevraud Abbey with you. Nestled in the beautiful Loire Valley is this giant abbey. Because of Eleanor of Aquitaine, we will stop here. During the 12th century, she served both as Queen of France and of England. She was buried here. It would be great if she could share her fascinating story here on culture-lovers.eu. So, Eleanor, thank you for accepting our invitation and feel free to tell your story.
Thank you, Don Quixote. I am quite humbled to be given this opportunity in the 21st century. I notice that the world has changed quite a bit since I was around. So, where do I begin? Let's start with a little history on this majestic abbey. Robert of Abrissel founded it around 1100. He came from Brittany. It is believed that he was the son of a priest. It was quite common for priests to get married during those days, and it was quite logical that the young Robert followed his father in his footsteps. The more he learned about Catholicism, the more he was drawn to Bishop Sylvester, who wanted to reform the church. Robert supported the work of the bishop, but had to flee Brittany when Sylvester died. The reforms did not go over well among the Breton clergy. Following his exile, Robert became an itinerant preacher southeast of Brittany. His ascetic life and eloquence attracted quite a following. Around 1100, he founded a monastic community at Fontevraud. He ensured that an abbess was chosen to manage this monastic community, and the community was expected to practice synesactism, a form of spiritual marriage. The practice was not widely accepted in the church, and after a few years it had to be abandoned. Fontevraud became an abbey with monks and nuns living separately. The abbey started off quite well thanks to royal gifts from my family. However, by the 13th century, the abbey was already in decline. It was made much worse by the Hundred Years' War that lasted from 1337 to 1453, and it all came to an end with the French Revolution. In 1792, all the things owned by the church, and so also the abbey, were declared to become national property. Napoleon even turned it into a prison. Let me now tell you a bit more about myself and my family. I was born in Bellon around 1123, in a little chateau. William X of Aquitaine and Eleanor of Châtellerault had me as their first child. How these two came together is a complicated story, and has everything to do with the adultery of my grandfather, William IX. My father, who loved his mother greatly, felt that this was not acceptable. Nevertheless, my father fell in love with the daughter of the woman my grandfather chose to be his unlawful lover. It resolved the conflict. And sure, without that complicated story, I wouldn't have seen the light. For me, as a little girl, it was only important that my father loved me, and that is what he did. As if the above story wasn't complex enough, there were many more. There was always conflict with the French king, conflicts with the church, and hassle with local noblemen. He went on pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela in 1137, when he was about 38 years old. My father never returned, he died on this trip. They told me it was food poisoning that killed him. I was a teenager at the time, suddenly in charge of all of Aquitaine. Many men tried to hijack me and force me into marriage. It was the chance of a lifetime for them to seize control over Aquitaine. Fortunately, my father had foreseen this, and had placed me under the custody of the French King Louis VI, just before he died. Louis VI saw this as an opportunity for his son. I married his son, Louis VII, and not long after that, the king, Louis VI, died. As a consequence, Louis VII and I became King and Queen of France. Louis was 17, and I was about 14. 2 kids on the throne, what a time was that! It wasn't the most successful of marriages for me and Louis VII. My family appreciated the more sensual pleasures of life, whereas he was brought up around monks. I still see it as a little wonder that I ended up giving him 2 daughters, that is Marie of France in 1145 and Alice of France in 1150. But Louis VII did not want daughters, he wanted a son, a successor. In 1152, the Church annulled my marriage to Louis VII. I was able to get my property back, so I became responsible for Aquitaine again. Oh yes, I forgot to tell you something. Louis and I also went on a crusade during this time. We traveled all the way to Antioch. The crusade was a disaster, and the tabloid press accused me at the time of seeing it as a pleasure trip. The whole thing didn't help us stay together. So in 1152 I had to decide what to do. There were still many noblemen that wanted to steal my land, so I'd better make sure to be married to someone I liked. The man I married was Henry II, a member of the House of Plantagenet. He was Duke of Anjou and Normandy. The marriage took place on May 18 of 1152, only 8 weeks after my previous marriage was annulled. Not even 2 years later, I became queen again. From England this time. My husband succeeded King Stephen of England. We suddenly had an empire that stretched from the northern border of England all the way to the Pyrenees. Quite a territory. The first years were quite successful. Henry and I rotated our roles in the territory constantly. I went to France when he was in England, and vice versa. We made sure to be together every Easter and Christmas. I gave him 5 sons and 3 daughters, William, Henry, Richard, Geoffrey, John, Matilda, Eleanor and Joan. It was not as if there were no problems. Louis VII, my first husband, was not too enthusiastic about losing the whole of Aquitaine to me, and quite a few noblemen within Aquitaine did not embrace my second husband as their king. Also, Henry, my new husband, was quite stubborn. He had difficulties to accept that there was also a church to reckon with. All of these factors affected how he interacted with everyone, including his children. His children were given all kinds of titles, but no power or money. It ultimately led to open conflict between him and his sons, his heirs. His son Henry did not like to wait till his father passed away. Yes, he was crowned king in waiting alongside his father, but that didn't bring him anything. Neither power nor resources were given to him. My son Henry was fed up with it and initiated a revolt against his father in 1173. It is clear that my ex-husband, the King of France, also played a role in this. He had become in the meantime the father-in-law of my son Henry, and he was still a rival of my current husband, King Henry II. I was also caught up in this. My husband ended up arresting me and throwing me in jail in England. Not that my life was too bad in there, but still. It wasn't until 1189 that my husband died, and I was released from there. My son Henry had died in the meantime, so my son Richard became King of England. After setting me free, Richard asked me to rule England in his name for some time. As a result of a crusade to the Holy Land, he earned his nickname, Richard the Lion-Hearted. It was a shame that Leopold of Austria kidnapped him in 1192 on his way back. In order to ensure his safe return home, I had to pay a significant amount of ransom money. Richard also died during my lifetime. In Caylus Chambreau, he was killed in a fight. It happened in 1199. Having to take so many of your loved ones to their grave is quite difficult for a mother. It was here at this abbey in Fontevraud that I spent my last years. When I died in 1204, I was entombed next to the tomb effigy of my second husband, Henry II, close to that of my son Richard, and close to that of my daughter Joan of England, Queen of Sicily. Here at the abbey is also the tomb of my grandmother Philippa, Countess of Toulouse. That was my life in a nutshell. I hope this gave you an idea of the turbulent times during the 12th century. It is still fascinating to think how French dukes ruled England in those days, and how many of the English royals ended up being buried here in France. Anyway, I will leave you now in the good hands of Don Quixote, and I wish you a beautiful day.
Wow, what a life you had, and what a beautiful story. I enjoyed it very much, so thank you for sharing it. For the weeks to come, we still have 2 stories left on France. One on the Battle of Roncesvalles, and one on the Abbey on Saint Michel. We are also planning to do an episode on how we think we will organize cooking in a camper. All kinds of things we have to think through before we commence our trip. So, if you like what we are doing, please give us a thumb up and subscribe to the channel. In the meantime, we will do our best to deliver another interesting episode next Friday. See you then.